Welcome to Dev Delight, Development Done Right, and today we're gonna talk about JavaScript Loops. Loops allow programmer to control the flow of the program and repeat code until a certain condition is met. Let's get into it. So before we get into all these different loops that JavaScript has, let's say we want to print out numbers from 0 to 5. How would we do that? Now, a beginner programmer might just have a bunch of console logs like this. And that certainly works. But what if you had to print out hundreds of numbers? Would you keep writing 100 lines of code? No, that would be very unproductive. So let's get rid of this and see another way to do it. But first we'll start with while loop. The way while loop works is we have a certain condition and it will keep executing as long as that condition is true. So for example, while counter is less than 6, keep printing out counter. And we'll also increment it right here. So now if I go and refresh, as you can see, we get the same result. Let's move on to do while loop. Let's reset counter to 0. Now the only difference between do while and while is do while will execute at least once before testing for the condition. Let's save that. Oh, we made a mistake. Well, I made a mistake. Forgot to increment the counter. If counter is always 0, it will keep going. So now that we're incrementing a counter, let's refresh. And as you can see, our while loop prints out 0 to 5 and our do while prints out 0 to 5. So let's say our condition was as long as counter is less than 0, right? What would happen with do while is it would still execute at least once. As you can see, it printed out 0. Next, we're gonna look into for loop. For loop is the most common used loop in programming, and it has 3 statements. The first is initialization statement, then it's the test condition statement, and iteration statement. So you start the for loop with 4, and next is initialization statement. So this is where you can set the counter to, let's say, 4. Our test condition is we want our counter to be, we want our loop to keep executing as long as counter is less than 8. And then here's the iteration step. Here we can increment, let's say, by 2. Let's say this is for loops. So as you can see, counter equals 4 is going to be that initialization step. Then counter less than 8 is the test condition, and counter equals, oops, actually this is wrong. It should be, the plus should be right here. So if you print this out, for loop is 4, for loop is 6. So what happened is we started with 4, we added plus 2, so it prints out first 4, then it adds 2, becomes 6, and then it tests the condition after it adds 2 more. 8 is not less than 8, so it exits the loop. There are two important keywords in JavaScript that you can use to break out of the loop or continue the loop from beginning. And let's start first with the break. The way break works is it breaks out of the inner loop and continues with the program flow. So let's see. Let's say we had a non-ending while loop. While true, keep printing true. Right? This loop would never exit because our condition is always true. However, what we can do is, let's say we have a counter, and the counter, since it's already going to be 6 over there, or 8, I mean, let's say we'll just keep incrementing the counter. But if counter equals to, let's say 14, then we can just break out of the loop. By the way, we can also just write this if statement like this, saving us space. All right. So once the counter reaches 14, it will break out of this non-ending while loop. Console log's not a function. Oh, made a mistake. Should have been console log. Let's refresh. True, true, true. So it printed out 6 times. Well, let's add a counter to make sure how many times. Let's refresh again. Okay, true 9, true 10, true 11, true 12, 13, 14. So it reached 14 and then it broke out of the loop. Now continue is kind of like opposite of break in a sense. It doesn't break out of the loop, but just goes back and restarts the loop, but does not reset the variables. So for example, let's say we have the same loop as up there. So when we get out of the while loop with the break, we know the counter is going to be 14, right? Continue printing out the counter. If counter equals to, say, 18, then we'll continue. Actually, let's increment the counter over here. Now, if counter equals to 19, we'll break to exit this loop. So I'm just showing you different ways you can mess around with loops and do crazy, weird things with them, right? But actually, let's make it a little bit more interesting in a way where it'll break when it's 22. But if it's 18, what we'll do is, so let's actually print out the counter at the bottom. So if the counter is 18, we'll continue. What will happen is it will skip the counter printout when it's 18, because when it hits, when it checks is it equal to 18, it will jump back to the top of the loop and increase the counter. And once it hits 22, it will break. When we refresh our page, it should not show 18. Boom. That's a boom. For in statement, loops through all the properties of an object. We could just loop through all the properties of this object without accessing them directly and printing out the prop. As you can see, it printed out all the properties, which is name, doors, and year. However, it didn't print out the actual values. If you also wanted to see the actual items of this object, not just the properties, you could just do this. Now we have name and the value. Let's talk about for off. Now for off comes with ES6 and it lets you loop through the values of an array. So for example, let's refresh. As you can see, you went through the whole array and printed out all the car brand names. And there's one more. For each. For each is very special because it lets you run a function for each item of the array. With the car R as well. You can just pass the value. It will grab the value from the array. Let's refresh. Oops, extra parenthesis. And as you can see, it also went through the array and printed out each value. You can also pass an index. So we could print out the index as well right away. So the index of Tesla is 0, BMW 1, Toyota 2. You could also pass an array, which is itself, for example. The third parameter, passing the actual array, is a little bit out of the scope of this tutorial, but basically, if we wanted to direct access to the array, we would pass it as a third parameter. There's also a fourth thing you can do with for each, which passing the this reference, which is also a little bit out of the scope of this tutorial, but you can look it up through JavaScript documentation, what it does. Now you should have the basic understanding of how loops work in JavaScript. The homework for today is go look up documentation for all these loops in JavaScript and code and play around with them. All right, I'll see you soon.